So what you're going to see tonight is the original 35 millimeter print from Universal, directed by Orson Welles in 1958. This was originally shot in aspect ratio 1:7, but it has been shown almost universally in 1:8 because at the time of the drive-in boom, and there's some anecdotal evidence that Orson himself shot it in that fashion because that was the aspect ratio that was supposed to be presented. We will see it in 1:8 tonight instead of 1:7, which should be good. In programming this film, I thought, well, can I have someone come and introduce this with me? And as it turns out, my good friend Lou Race, who is here today, he's the only person I know that worked with Orson Welles and Boris Karloff and Peter Bogdanovich and a lot of other people. And he worked with Orson on his last film. So without further ado, please welcome the one and only Lou Race. You worked with Orson on his last picture, The Other Side of the Wind, and let's start there. How did you get that job, and what was the experience like working with Orson?
It was Orson's last film. He made it in 1971, started it in 1971. It was completed in 2018, 46 years in the making. It was intended as a satire of Hollywood circa 1972. And as such, some of it's a little bit obscure or teeth grating or embarrassing, but it stands up pretty well. He also made it as his own first trial in a multimedia experience. The story of the film centers on a Hollywood party given for an aging classic Hollywood director played by John Huston, who's trying to make a new movie that's very avant-garde and shishi and very 1972. As such, he wanted to film it in as many formats as possible. 35 millimeter, 16 millimeter, every video format he could come up with. And he had an incredible amount of material. He had over like 200,000 feet of film to be organized, and most of it was left unorganized after his death. And I want to give a shout out to the editor, Rob Morawski, who put this thing together and who said this movie could not have been edited by Orson in 1971 because the editing devices did not exist, the hardware did not exist to conform and to combine all these various formats together. So once again, Orson was not only ahead in his storytelling abilities, he was ahead of his time technologically. So how I got involved.
Yeah.
1971, I've just gotten out of the Army. I'm back at my home in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I'm deciding whether I should come back to UCLA and continue my studies in film. I get a call from a good friend of mine, Frank Marshall, who was a buddy of mine in film school. Frank says, would you like to come out and be a part of a movie that's starting? And I said, sure, I can be out in a couple of days, no problem. He said, did I mention that the director is Orson Welles? I was there the next day. 2 days later, I'm in Carefree, Arizona. We're filming at the mansion of a person Orson referred to as the nut and bolt king of Arizona. And my first job was to go out and back and paint some wooden slatted shutters white. And Orson used these shutters as transitional devices to go from room to room, basically because he knew that he did not have enough money to complete the project at that time. And he knew that he would be shooting in other places at other times, and so he used these shutters as connective tissue to connect a room in a mansion in Arizona to a room in a mansion in Los Angeles, where two characters would begin a conversation, they'd pass by the slatted dividers, and then 6 months later in Los Angeles, they'd pass by another set of slatted dividers and go talk to someone who probably wasn't even cast when they began their conversation in Arizona. So this is the way he was working. there was no person on the crew who did continuity, no script supervisor. It was all kept in Orson's head. And so there was a lot of operating by faith. When Orson said, I want you to run over there and look out there and do this, people just did it.
What about some of the people in the film? You had John Huston, of course, Norman Foster, Edmond O'Brien, Paul Stewart. What was that whole scene like? And I guess Orson kind of took over this house in Arizona, and the people initially who owned it were impressed by having Orson Welles there, but they didn't know he was going to turn it into a movie set.
Yes, well, Orson basically took over whatever set he was on.
Yeah.
Including a drive-in in Van Nuys. These people would come, and it was like a John Ford cattle call. Everybody would show up, well, because I guess nobody really wanted to stay in a motel in Arizona. They would either be up at the house, and there was a green room, and Orson would call on them as needed. And as a young, aspiring film student, I had not had that much experience on professional sets. So my first introduction to a director-actor dynamic was Orson Welles directing John Huston.
And what was that like?
Well, it was interesting. They did not act like elder statesmen of the cinema. They acted like fanatic film students. Orson just enjoyed working. He enjoyed the process. John enjoyed the process. They enjoyed each other. They were constantly ribbing each other. I am the only living witness to this story. We were filming the party sequence in Arizona, and we were doing a shot where John and an associate are walking down a corridor. And another one of his flunkies, played by Norman Foster, comes up and says something to him inaudible. And John pauses for a moment and then says something back, and they all go their separate ways. So Orson goes, cut. Great, John. I'd like to do it again. And this time, could you pace it up a little bit? And John said, well, I don't know, Orson. I was just taking a moment to absorb what young Norman had told me and to formulate a reply. And Orson said, John, please, there is nothing more soul-wearying. And at this point, Huston joined in with him, and they finished the sentence in unison. There is nothing more soul-wearying than watching an actor think. But Orson, in general, was pretty generous with his actors. He hired Edmond O'Brien, who at that point was essentially unemployable because he was in very poor health and no one wanted to take the insurance risk. As a sidebar, he made the Wild Bunch uninsured because Sam Peckinpah had the same kind of guts that Orson Welles did. And Orson would go out of his way to give Edmond things to do and shots and scenes to be in, just so he didn't feel like he was some, peripheral appendage on the production, that he had an integral part. Lily Palmer was in the movie. She played the hostess to the party. She never set foot in the United States. Her entire part was shot in Germany, and again, the whole continuity of everything she did was in Orson's mind, so he could match what she was doing to somebody else who would be working in the United States 2 or 3 months later, or in some cases, 2 or 3 months before. So Susan Strasberg was in it, daughter of the Method Actor Studio, Lee Strasberg, right? And she was completely with the program. No complaints. I remember that she had a huge speech that was about a half a page long. And Orson, upon hearing it, decided that he didn't like it. And so he began to cut it. And every take we did, he would subtract the line. So Susan, you don't need to say this about this. Susan, instead of saying this, why don't you just say this? She knew what was going on, but she wasn't going to fight the program. And eventually, she ended up, her half-page speech ended up being 2 lines. Now, I will say that Orson was not infallible. There were mountains he could not conquer. There was a part in the show for a young woman who John Huston's character is attracted to at the party, and he begins to come on with her. So we needed a young woman to play this part. Frank was prescient. He said, I'll go to the University of Arizona, and I'll go to their theater department, and I'll get a couple of aspiring actresses, and they can come up in audition. Okay. While he's doing that, one of the European producers on the show is driving down the street in Phoenix, sees a young woman coming out of a laundromat, and basically pulls up and goes, hey, young lady, would you like to be in a movie? And she says yes. Her name was Kathy Lucas. And she knows nothing about what's going on. There were times when the combined talents of Orson Welles and John Huston could not get a line reading out of her. One of her first lines is, Huston starts to come on to her and says, well, my dear, would you like to fly to Paris with us tomorrow? And her response is, well, gee, I don't know. I have an exam in the morning, and at school in the morning, and the combined talents of Orson Welles and John Huston were defeated to the point where John Huston was down on his knees so he could be at eye level with her, saying, well, my dear, why don't you try saying it this way? Well, gee, I don't know. I have to be at class in the morning. However, she grew into her part. And eventually Orson was sticking her in scenes, saying, she has a nice visual presence. And his sort of recruitment of acting talent extended to the crew and extended to me. Okay, so if you ever happen to see The Other Side of the Wind, available on Netflix right now, and you take the time code up to about 25 minutes and 25 seconds, you can see my performance as cineast number 1. Orson was doing party scene. He says, Lou, just get in there, talk to this young woman. And I said, okay, Orson, what do you want me to say? And he said, say something film student-y. And so I had about 10 seconds to come up with a line. Well, the first thing I did is I decided I would be smoking. So I lit a cigarette because I wanted to show that the debauchery at this party was like never ending. And so it came time for me to speak, and I said, I've written this down because I've been misquoting it for years. I came up with the following gem. The ontology of its iconography is so incredibly facile.
That sounds like a film student.
Yes.
So how long were you, when did you finish, when did you get off the film? When did you finish with Orson?
I don't think I'm off the film yet. Orson would film until he ran out of money. Then everybody would dissipate, and Orson would go out and do some movie or do some commercials, get enough money to recongregate everybody, usually not in the same place. When we left Arizona after 2 weeks, we never came back. We spent time in Los Angeles and other places. If you were on the crew, you better have your equipment packed and ready to go. If you were in the cast, you better have your costume in a suitcase ready to be pulled up and taken, because somebody's going to call up and say, Orson needs you in Santa Rosita tomorrow. And you would have to show up.
There.
And you would be there.
Yeah.
It was an incredible labor of love for everybody involved in the project. I could tell you dozens of stories.
Well, the bar is open after the movie,
Yes.
so Lou will be up there. Let's talk a little bit about Touch of Evil. When I met Charlton Heston which was in the men's room of the Egyptian theater after he introduced the Ten Commandments, and we talked for a while in the lobby. I asked him about Touch of Evil, and he said, I'm just a guy in Touch of Evil looking for his wife. The movie's about Orson, you know, about Orson's character, and he's kind of right. And one of the interesting things that I found is the movie Ed Wood. They have an actor playing Orson Welles sitting in Musso and Frank's, I think.
Vincent D'Onofrio.
Yeah, Vincent D'Onofrio, a good actor. And he complains that, oh, I'm stuck making this movie. Charlton Heston is playing a Mexican. And in actuality, the reason Orson directed the film was because of Charlton Heston, because Orson was originally signed up to play the corrupt sheriff that we'll see in the film. And Heston was the star. He was the guy that was going to make this go. Mm-hmm. And so he talked to the brass at Universal, and he said, you're just going to have Orson act? You know, he directed Citizen Kane. It's Orson Welles. And they go, yeah, that's right. What a good idea. So all of a sudden, Orson became the director. The script that they had was thrown away. Orson rewrote the whole thing in 17 days. And what we'll see, this is Orson's film, from the first tracking shot that is one of the longest uninterrupted takes that went on a long time, because at the end of it there's a border guard that has like 3 lines, and he kept going dry, and finally Orson said, just move your lips and we'll dub the lines in, which is what happened. And the other thing is Heston told me Orson was so clever because he knew, because of his reputation, that the brass was going to be hovering around him. There's a scene in the movie involving a shoebox in an apartment with a bunch of characters, and what he did was he blocked that whole scene out, and then he got the principals over off the books, so-called, and rehearsed the whole thing. And so when he was there, that was the first scene being shot. First day, you've got the brass there, everything, and Orson shot through the whole scene like in one day, and he said, cut, we're 2 days ahead of schedule. And all the brass said, boy, this guy's really good, and they went away and they left him alone.
Yeah. Even though he didn't roll cameras until after lunch.
Yes.
They were just totally panic-stricken.
Yeah.
But the great thing about Touch of Evil is that it's so much more than a couple of tricky shots.
Exactly.
I mean, he got some real depth out of his characters. Dennis Weaver. Is there anybody here who hasn't seen the movie?
Or seen the movie. Yeah.
Everybody's seen it. Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Dennis Weaver's part was again worked out between him and Orson before shooting, and just to get the right level that didn't go quite over the edge.
Yeah.
And for my money, equally as impressive as the first shot and the shots in the apartment is the last 15 minutes of the movie when Orson and his detective partner are walking away from Tanya's bordello. The editing in that is just incredible. And I think that towards the end of his career, and I think it's to bring it back to The Other Side of the Wind, Other Side of the Wind was designed to be a movie that was going to be created in the editing. And again, the fact that Bob Bukowski was able to emulate the style that Orson once again laid out in a memo, I think is incredible.
Yeah, and Orson also had his old friends, Joe Cotton, Marlena Dietrich, Ray Collins. I mean, this is Orson's movie. I think in retrospect, at the time, it wasn't really as appreciated as it is now. But when you see the performances, particularly by Akam Tamaroff, who I adore, who's great, it really is one of Orson Welles' greatest movie, and it's certainly our pleasure to bring it to you tonight here, and it's my pleasure having Lou up here sharing some of his recollections. So thank you, and let's enjoy Touch of Evil. Thank you.